Fractured stories. Fractured stories. I was a young boy when it happened, barely 13 summers old. I was a curious boy, and as they say, curiosity kills the cat. Only mine was more punted across the yard and given a stern talking to. As I had grown, being very invested in nature up to that point, I had learned of the birds of the skies, the wolves of the forest, and everything else that swam, creeped, and crawled throughout. But what I had seen that day overturned all that I knew. It would open my eyes to the wonders of the universe and its infinite possibility, and also to its subversive terror, then made very much loud and painfully obvious. I was away from my parents that morning. I had previously been with a friend of mine when we got separated. I found myself sitting by the water when the water of the bay began bubbling furiously. Then the fishermen were shouting. Dozens of fish had floated to the surface, but they were dead. Suddenly, a foul stench filled the air as people started screaming for the fishermen and everyone else to get away from the water's edge. It slowly rose out of the watery blue, billowing thick black smoke from its joints, killing any bird that had been flying near it. There it was, the truth. It stood sentinel, taller than any skyline, and with a steely gaze, it outstretched the same undeniable truth to the far ends of the earth. It had blared on every radio frequency, and had been shown on every television. Soon it reached the eyes and ears of the powers that be, and they, in their desperation, sent their tanks, their planes, and their many soldiers. I stood there, silent. I craned my head up towards what I presumed was its face, but absent were any signs of its eyes, nose, or mouth. In their place was a strange design engraved onto the front. I was lost in awe of the monster in front of me, seemingly a machine, but none manufactured, let alone invented by any man or nation. No, this had come from somewhere else. A man had grabbed my arm and suddenly pulled me away. As we were leaving, I noticed the tanks, the planes, and the many soldiers. We got further, then I heard the first shells go off. I heard the rattle of the machine guns fired from the planes as they strafed to and fro. I heard the soldiers bark orders to one another. I felt the ground shake as the tanks fired their cannons. Everyone fled from the fighting. We ran through the street, dodging the soldiers and tanks. Then we heard the horn, and our pace hastened. The horn sounded a second time. Then someone screamed, shouted to run faster. Then finally a third horn blew, then a massive shockwave blew out from the monster's feet. It was so strong it blew out windows, cracked cannon barrels, and sent men flying through the air. We dove into an alley to avoid it. Entering the alley, I turned back to watch a soldier flung and slammed against the building. He fell to the ground and laid there motionless. My savior rushed us through the alleys between the buildings. I kept my head lowered, to shield it from the rubble and debris falling down on us. As we ran, a body fell from atop a building, only he wasn't dead. It had been one of the riflemen stationed on the rooftops. I heard a loud snap as he landed. His screams filled the alleyway, but we didn't stop for him. I turned one last time to see two people helping him up and starting towards us. We were joined by them as we continued to flee. The cannons and tanks continued to fire. Round after round split the air and impacted the monster's metal body with no effect. From above, planes peppered it with more bombs and machine guns, all in a vain attempt to stall its advance. We finally exited the alleys and crossed the street. I heard a low roar quickly rise in volume. I looked up to see a plane diving towards the ground. It crashed onto the street, clearing most of the objects in its path. When it settled, I saw how badly damaged it was. Whatever was in the smoke that rose from the monster's joints made flying there seemingly impossible. It seemed to eat away and corrode anything it came into contact with. We continued running until we reached the edge of town. Then we hopped the fence with our new companions and made for the countryside. We left the sounds of the monster putting the township to the sword behind us, but we knew it was only temporary. This was the norm then. For months up until that point, we had heard on the news and watched on the television the horror the monster had wrought upon Europe. It started in Russia and swept aside the entire Red Army. Then it moved towards Germany, then Poland, Belgium, France. Every old, monarchical nation that once set a proud sabaton upon the pages of history had been swept aside like ants from an anthill. All the materials they could gather, all the men they could muster wasn't enough. The monster was pounded by artillery while deadly black smoke choked the air, and horrors of the Great War sneakily waded through a blood-filled trench back into people's minds. It was not a war that we could win as piles of bodies grew ever taller. But Europe had seen its fair shares of bloody and costly wars, and this would be no different. It was a demon seen many times before, seen through the glazed lenses of a worn gas mask. A man charging across no man's land with a bayonet raised, doggedly running towards his death with glory on his tongue, being cheered on by a crowd of pigs safer in 5 minutes back home than he had been the past several months, where he spent his time drowning in the victories and heroism he was promised upon enlisting, and the love and adoration he received upon returning. When he does return, he rises from the sea as a broken man, the horrors he witnessed billowing off his back, and his scruples felt heavily at every step. We were hiding now, within the basement of an old house, nestled deep in the countryside. Our group had finished exchanging their pleasantries and were seated around a small table nibbling on rations, with nothing to show our worn and tear-soaked faces in a dim candlelight. The soldier from earlier finally had a splint applied to his leg, and was stable for the moment. His name was Private Kent Lansborough. He was laid up on the floor upon a modest bed thrown together from mats and blankets found around the house. He was relaxing himself with a flask of brandy while staring blindly up at the ceiling. The two other people were siblings. Will and Elizabeth Bailey were their names. They had been in town visiting family when the monster made its appearance. Suffice to say, the time for ensuring familial connections had long passed. They were seated by the other tables by the young private's bed, mingling among themselves. I imagine the placement was purposeful in case Kent needed anything. And lastly, my savior, a rather grizzled and ageless man by the name of Arthur Kearns. He was a fisherman, one who just happened to be walking back from the store when he saw me by the lakeside. As soon as the monster appeared, he took me and ran. If it wasn't for him, my circumstances then would have been much different. I sat with Arthur for company while he sliced into an apple. He paused to regard me, and with curiosity, the same one might reserve for a close relation. It was true I didn't know him, but faced with the fact that he saved me, I was quick to trust him. He did prove in some sense that he knew my parents. He referenced them both by name. He told me of his time during the Great War. My father also served during the same time, and he and Arthur served in the same regiment. He finished by reassuring me that there was a good chance my parents were still alive. He cemented this with a quip about how much of a bulwark my father was during the war. We talked for a short while before we all shut our eyes for the night, with Kent taking the first watch. The following morning, we ate what food we could find and we left. Arthur motioned that we should head west. Reinforcing this, he said that the safest place was in the wake of the monster, not so much the path. Kent seemed to agree, as he had theorized the monster was too focused on its linear path of destruction to care about much behind it. It might have even presumed any threat behind it was killed already. I stood quietly between Elizabeth and William as I listened to their speculation, and continued to listen in silence till they concluded. With that, we were on our way. Arthur led the group, while Elizabeth tended to me and William assisted Kent in walking. Along our journey, we would come across those in hiding from the monster. Most of them were common folk mixed with deserters from the army. We would converse with some of them. One man had been separated from his brother when the monster first attacked. 2 soldiers had hung their helmets in a small farmhouse, and many others. This was testament to something. The monster seemed to move and destroy with little to no rhyme or reason. It only seemed to move, and left only silence in its wake. Absolute destruction. All around us there lay quietly the husks of tanks and planes alike. Therewith mingled the bodies of fallen soldiers, their faces frozen with horror. Their lifeless stares the only proof of their final moments. All about the fields by with houses attended were littered them who fought bravely. Not once did one lay who didn't die facing his home, but facing his enemy, the monster. Arthur was weary as he regarded the aftermath. His eyes stared 1,000 leagues outward, as if he had finally raised himself above a trench and laid his eyes upon no man's land. A scene he had likely regarded with some thought or feelings less than endearing, more than he cared to recount. Even now I can hear what he heard, the crack of the rifle, the whistle of the bombs, and the helpless screams of men too far beyond the reach of their comrades. He noticed I was staring at him, and without an expression, he softly urged us to continue. We marched through the once green countryside, now brown, burnt, and unforgiving, with everywhere corpses both human and mechanical. It was later we heard the distant shattering of guns and the thunderous feet of the monster. Its telling horn assured us it was near. It sounded 3 times, and the boom of a shockwave roared through the air. Quickly we ran into a thicket to hide. When we settled, Kent and Arthur readied their rifles. The siblings attended to me, likely presuming I was scared. A fair presumption, considering I was a child after all. I guess in that moment I was scared, but I could barely mind my own fears given the circumstances. Kent suggested that we waited there until the monster was far enough away that we could continue. Everyone seemed in agreement. We huddled there for a while amid the sounds of distant fighting. While we were there, William had pulled out a chocolate bar from his coat and offered half of it to me. I reached for it, but Elizabeth intercepted it and tore into 2 more halves and gave one to me. She stated that a sugar-fueled child was the last thing they needed, as she inhaled her share of the bar. After she finished chewing, she swallowed and smiled. Involuntarily, I chuckled and William cracked a joke, which only caused me to laugh harder. Arthur came back and explained that we were moving soon. He was abruptly interrupted when the ground and even the trees of the thicket shook violently. There was a sound, a loud thump, something likened to a full suitcase being thrown on a bed after a long journey. Then the monster sounded its horns. These weren't the ones we'd heard previously. It first sounded twice, but these were in low volume. The final third was much louder, and sounded as if in response to the first 2. Arthur, curiously, ran outside of the thicket to a small hill that sat at an elevation higher to us. He returned seconds later, practically tumbling back into the thicket, his face awash with excitement. "One of its arms," he bellowed. They blew off one of its arms. He urged William to take Kent and I and Lisbeth to follow. We emerged from the tree line, and I laid my eyes upon the monster once again. It stood motionless, its left arm lying lifelessly on the ground beside it. I could hear a distant sound of cheering. The monster and its now separated arm were still exchanging horn blows. Most of them were high notes, then some low notes. We watched as the feeling of progress melted away, leaving us exposed and collectively embarrassed. This monster was capable of things far beyond our comprehension, and to even state thusly barely scratched the surface of what was possible. The colossal machine let out one continuous horn blow, then it leaned forward, and within moments the loud, distant cheering soon devolved into screams. Arthur watched as tanks, machine guns, and anything metal was quickly and violently lifted up into the air and brought towards the monster. They were absorbed into its body, right through its outer skin. What metals were buried beneath the ground were torn from the soil and rock. Anything metal inside the houses were ripped from the walls. And any poor soul who had metal fittings on their uniform also fell victim. Suddenly, a series of loud crashes interrupted the mesmerizing scene before us. The severed arm had seemingly magnetized itself to the ground and was now swinging at anything nearby. The arm swung from the middle as if attached to a pole, spinning again and again, utterly destroying anything it hit. Arthur slowly lowered his binoculars and let out a long sigh. It was silent now. You could hear a pin drop, like the pin of a grenade against dry stone. We stood there as the monster and its separate piece laid down destruction. Another line of defense wiped aside. Later, we sat together in the thicket, under the cover of dark once again amid dim but comforting candlelight. I sat by Elizabeth, speechless, while she and I finished off a makeshift sandwich. William was seated with Kent while they finished off Kent's brandy. Arthur sat quietly by the entrance to the thicket, the hair-thin pillar of smoke from his cigarette calmly rising into the air, and a rifle resting by his side. I recall coming over and sitting by his side. I glanced up at his face, with a steely expression gazing out into the far black, with the sundered bodies of ruined trees reaching towards the sky as if in dire prayer to God above, akin to the men who prayed and sundered with them. Plainly, I asked him what was out there, out in the yonder he was staring so intently at. He answered, in a whisper, that he was merely thinking to himself. He just happened to become a bit distracted while doing so. He stamped out his cigarette, and then unscrewing the cap from his canteen, he took a full swig of ice-cold water. His face engulfed with relief, if only for a moment. With purpose, he spoke. He spoke of his time in the Great War, of the life he led and left behind, of the men he knew and missed, and of the horrors that traded with him so many years later. All of it smashed together to turn Arthur into the man he was. A walking horse of a man, sealed within his own skin and welded shut with searing fire and dressed with mustard gas. Arthur placed his hand on my shoulder, and he said that if I ever find myself in the same position he was in, staring out into no man's land, remember that while you may see terrible things, there are also very good things. Some might have called it cliché, but was likely the best he could offer considering how little he had to work with. I look back on it now, and I respect him for trying. I returned to my sleeping bag and quickly fell asleep. When I woke the following morning, I was shaken awake by Elizabeth. I slowly opened my eyes. Once I fully opened them, I saw stood before me 3 soldiers of the crown. They were likely leftovers from the recent engagements in the area. But besides that, they were standing, 1 in front, 2 behind him. The lead man raised his helmet and calmly apologized to Elizabeth for startling her. He motioned towards Arthur and Kent. I looked over and saw that Arthur had been redressing Kent's leg and adjusting his splint, something that had been done a few times already. The lead man asked if they were in need of medical supplies or attention, pointing to one of his men behind him who was a medic. Arthur motioned the man forward, then he and their medic got to work on Kent. The lead and the last man finally joined us, and once Kent had been properly dressed, Arthur and the lead man got to talking. They exchanged their pleasantries, and the lead man introduced himself as Peter Cooks. His two compatriots were Deers and Jones. They were part of a unit that was sent behind the monster to search out any wounded. He finished by saying that it was lucky for us they decided to check the thicket. I was fully awake now, and Cooks and his men had joined us for our humble breakfast. William had brewed up a pot of different things he had gathered from prowling ruined buildings. I couldn't tell you exactly what was in it, but it was warm, tasted halfway decent enough, and lastly it was filling, so I wasn't complaining. This had been the first real meal in a couple days or so, and to have it warm and in good company was not to be taken for granted. As we ate, William told of his dream of becoming a chef. Lisbeth smiled and shrugged it off, commenting that it could use some extra condiments. William, annoyed, also just shrugged it off, although I thought I heard him mutter something under his breath. Cooks was the next one to speak his opinion about the food. He said while it may have needed some assistance from condiments or some other ingredient, it was certainly better than the rations they had been eating previously. This seemed to help lift William's spirit. Finally, Kent stated that the food, while simple, at least helped him forget about his leg. This gave everyone a good laugh, one that may have been well needed. The following morning we parted ways with Cooks and his men, and also Kent. He would be sent back to the army with them into a proper medical hospital. He wished as well, as we wished him as well. The last thing he said to me before he left was to keep a strong spirit, and that this would be all over soon. It wouldn't be until later that I'd find out what he meant by that. Surely, most of the nation's militaries and leaders were in communication with each other. Ever since the monster first set foot in the Soviet Union, that the guns and cannons of the Second World War ceased to come together against the monster. Hence, humanity would spend several long months sending men and machinery into a meat grinder, where the threat had the privilege of an advantage. Tanks were stamped into the earth, planes fell from the sky in heaps, and men were slaughtered in droves, all in an effort to slow it down, to hold back a potentially catastrophic event, one more so than mankind's previous dealings, before the emergence of this beast of metal. As it would go, the nations of the world had reached the climax of their plan, the invention of a bomb, one more powerful than any invented before it. And they even made a second one. According to reports published post-emergence, that a weakness had been discovered by happenstance. They would go to capitalize upon this, and set about developing a bomb capable of delivering a radioactive blast, powerful enough to disable the monster. This would reach fruition on the southern tip of the UK, with the United States Air Force in cohesion with the remnants of the German Luftwaffe, and squadrons of the Japanese Imperial Air Force would come together as a whole in one last attempt at victory. One early morning, they would meet the monster just off the coast. In two bright flashes, the monster was, seemingly, defeated. I must say that very few planes returned from that mission. In the final battle, the monster exhibited abilities we hadn't seen yet, and this surprise of sorts cost the final assault many good pilots. We would come across this revelation of victory in central London. After many extra days of traveling, we found ourselves once again in good company, and by a radio from where the good news was presented. To this day, the monster lies there, still and lifeless. We are 20 years past, and many still remember the events, but even more look back upon it and have trouble believing it ever happened. The buildings which crumbled were rebuilt. Armies worth of men lost were replenished. And the very body of the monster is now widely believed to be a simple earthwork from times past, slowly reclaimed by the tides. Sometimes even I have trouble believing it happened. I was young but impressionable. I saw mankind bring forth its weapons, forged in anger and prejudice, designed for a purpose of external self-destruction, and they were tossed aside by something far beyond our comprehension. There is little more I can tell you, and I have heard of the reports from New York and Mexico City, and these are taken in dismay. It would seem my theory was true. It was here all along. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was episode 17 of Fraction Stories, The Big Metal Man. Originally written and voiced by Musical Pumpkin, yours truly. I would like to thank you everyone who stayed till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed putting it together. I would like to point out and point you to Myuu Music, as he is the man behind the tune you heard while you were listening to the video. I will be leaving a link to his personal website as well as his YouTube channel in the description below. Please go check him out. He's pretty awesome, and the music he makes is pretty dope. Alright, that's the 17th episode. We're 3 away from episode 20. I'm not sure if we're going to be doing anything, but we'll see. This was your good friend, the Musical Pumpkin, watching over your pumpkin patch. I have another big video on the horizon, and that's all I gotta say. Stay dope, folks, and stay safe.